Let me start it. Record. All right, now it's recording. Okay. All right. So, okay. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I know this stuff can get a little too dicey, but we'll try to keep it straightforward. We've gone through a lot. We've gone through the formative period since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, all the way through British rule, and up until the Arab Revolt in from 36 to 39. So now Great Britain has reached a point of essentially no return. Now Great Britain has pretty much said to itself, we can't do it. We can't handle the situation on the ground, and we need a different solution. But before we get into what Great Britain had in mind to do and what it proposed next, I want to point you to something here. These are known as transfer committees. And one of the major Zionist talking points is that Palestine was a desolate land, the famous slogan that was propagated by Israel Zangwill, a land without a people for a people without a land. Why would you need to set up transfer committees if there was nobody to transfer, if the land was really empty? So this is what you call an internal contradiction within an ideological framework. These are internal contradictions within Zionism, within the Zionist ideology. Because they know the truth, but they need to use lies to make their message clear to their audience. So this is a propaganda tool. So this is just something to keep in mind throughout this period, all the way up until 1948, that these committees were established and eventually were maintained under a different name, even post 1948 as well. But this is also in line with the Zionist ideology, and this is kind of the theme that we've been going over the last few weeks. Okay, so Great Britain held a roundtable conference in London from February to March of 1939. The British invited the Palestinian Arab leadership, but not those who were involved in any kind of violence during the what they call the Arab Revolt. But the Jewish invitees got to select any reps they wanted, regardless of who was involved and who was not. So we've seen a theme here throughout the mandatory period that Great Britain, in pursuance of the Balfour Declaration, held the Jewish population to a higher standard. No, provided them with superior means and treated them as the superior people, worthy of more rights and worthy of the land, essentially. So this pattern is not something new. But interestingly enough, the goal of the conference was to produce an agreement. And if no agreement can be reached, Great Britain would implement its own policy. This was around the same time that the Hussein McMahon correspondence became public. We know what those were. Those were the assurances to the Sharif of Mecca that you would get, Arab independence in these lands. And as we discussed, I believe in the first or second session, that these lands were understood later on to include, at the time it was understood to include Palestine as well, but it was definitively proven later on that it did include Palestine. So that became public. So all the independent Arab states at the time participated. Okay, Egypt became independent in 1922, but it was still under British influence up until 1952. Iraq became independent in 1932 and was declared officially as a republic in 1958. And Saudi Arabia was independent in 1933. Transjordan, this is the difficult one, it was split off from the mandate as it was first put together, but not as it was when it was ratified in 1924. So 1921, Amir Abdullah established the Emirate of Transjordan. In 1928, England and Transjordan enter into a treaty, and basically in 1946, Amir Abdullah became King Abdullah of Transjordan, and that's when it gained full independence. But around this time, it was still basically its own territory. And of course, the Arab delegation from Palestine, as I discussed, but it did not include those that were involved in the violence. So the British proposal was essentially, we have to still maintain the mandate. This new state still would neither be Jewish nor Arab. Both sides rejected it, and the conference ended in failure in 1939. The reason why the Palestinian side rejected it was because it was not a renunciation of the mandate, because the mandate included what? The Balfour Declaration. And that was at the heart of the Palestinian Arab opposition. So, Great Britain has had enough. I can't get you both to agree. We can't figure it out because we know that by implementing the Balfour Declaration, we're trampling all over the rights of the indigenous population. We can't do that. So the British white paper, the MacDonald white paper, that was the prime minister at the time, was issued on May 17th, 1939. This reflected the new British statement of policy. Here, Great Britain envisioned instead ending the mandate by 1949, not renouncing the text of the mandate, but just ending the mandatory administration altogether by 1949, with independence for Palestine in which both Palestinians and Jews would share in government. Uh-oh, that sounds like democracy. So guess what happened? Do you think the Zionists would have accepted that? Absolutely not. Because now they're disclaiming any intention of creating a Jewish state. But look at this. There was no acceptance of having an independent Palestinian Arab state. That was still the great majority of the population at that time. And that was still rejected.
How many Arab countries attended the conference?
5 or 6. I just went through them. Those that were quote unquote independent at that time. They had very little power. It's just quantitative presence, nothing more. So, Great Britain drafted a plan that until so the goal was to limit land purchases, limit immigration. Zionist projects required Arab consent. How dare you? You have to request consent from the owners of the land on what you can do with it. Of course they were going to reject that, right? So how did the Zionist movement respond to this? What do you think? They said, okay, you want to limit immigration? Just going to do it illegally. Cares what you say. We're going to do what we want to do. And guess what? This is not a new policy from the Zionist movement. This was intensified in this period. But this intensification period pretty much created a divorce, in a way, between Zionist settler colonialism and British imperialism and British colonialism. Because now that, well, thank you, Great Britain, you've done a lot for us so far. Now you're going to shift course? Okay, we have what we need so far to essentially establish a state. So we're just going to go ahead and just do it our own way. We don't care what you say. There's this belief from the indigenous population, Palestinian Arab population, that their lands, farms, and livelihood would be taken from them. And that is the reason why they've pursued this course of halting immigration. So now we're going to limit it to 75,000 new immigrants over a 5-year span. Well, we can't establish a Jewish majority in Palestine if you're going to limit it to that extent. So that can't work. So we'll engage in illegal immigration. And the notion of partition, remember during the Appeal Commission in 1937, Great Britain said, okay, fine, we'll give you this small piece of land here, and we'll annex the remaining territory to Transjordan. The Zionist movement were slightly acceptant of that because, hey, that's giving us more territory than what we own already. So we'll use that, and David Ben Gurion made clear at the time, we're using that as a base to further our expansionist designs. So that was not the end all be all. That was just the beginning towards a much larger end. So Great Britain now is admitting that the establishment of self-supporting, independent Arab and Jewish states within Palestine is impracticable. The Balfour Declaration was not intended to convert Palestine into a Jewish state against the will of the Arab population. But why such an admission? Why would you even need to make such a statement? Because you know the policies that you've pursued was against the will of the indigenous Palestinian Arab population. So you have to make that statement as a way to balance what the policies that have actually been pursued and implemented. So now you want to create this balance. So listen to what Great Britain said. With the Royal Commission, His Majesty's government believed that the framers of the mandate in which the Balfour Declaration was embodied could not have intended that Palestine should be converted into a Jewish state against the will of the Arab population of the country. And His Majesty's government therefore now declare unequivocally that it is not part of their policy that Palestine should become a Jewish state. They would indeed regard it as contrary to their obligations to the Arabs under the mandate, as well as to the assurances which have been given to the Arab people in the past. St. McMahon correspondence. That the Arab population of Palestine should be made the subjects of a Jewish state against their will. The reason why they have to make this large admission is because that's exactly what's been happening. So, hey, we don't intend for what's happening to actually continue to happen. Too late. The damage has been done, right? So Great Britain said the objective is the establishment within 10 years of an independent Palestine. An independent state should be one in which Arabs and Jews share in government in such a way as to ensure that the essential interests of each community are safeguarded. So this kind of even-handed, now you went from being totally on one side to now trying to strike an even hand. And the Zionists didn't like that. Because an even hand means there's no Jewish supremacy. Even hand means there's no Balfour Declaration paramountcy. That was the paramount policy. That was the number one thing that you were focused on. Balfour Declaration, Balfour Declaration, implementing the Balfour Declaration. Now you're going against that? That's going against us and our ideology and our agenda. So now we must go against you, Great Britain, the mandatory government, right? So the Zionist response was utter rejection and defiance. Okay, so you want to limit immigration. Okay, we don't care. We'll do it illegally. After all, we've been engaging in illegal immigration for some time now. Remember the Hope Simpson report in 1929 that we went over last week? About 10 years prior, which said that thousands of unauthorized immigrants settled in Palestine. And so between 1939 and 1940, over 20,000 illegal immigrants settled in Palestine. The Zionist leadership even went so far as to damage property and risk lives in order to increase the Jewish population in Palestine. I want you all to look up the SS Patria. SSPATRIA. On November 25th, 1940, it was decided by Great Britain that illegals would be deported to an alternative place within the British Empire. and the first contingent boarded the SS Patria in the Haifa harbor, it was scuttled at her moorings due to a bomb explosion that was planted by the Haganah. Haganah is the forerunner to what is the modern day IDF, what we call the IOF, killing 250 to 270 lives, mostly Jewish refugees from Nazi-occupied Europe. The intention was to disable the ship to prevent relocation of the refugees, but it caused more damage and it caused death. But it wasn't just illegal immigration that the Zionists turned to as a response to the British White Paper. What else did the Zionist movement do? The one thing that they love to talk about now regarding Palestinians. Okay, we're going to engage in terrorist acts. Zionist movement engaged in politically motivated murders, assassinations, sabotage, robberies, destruction of government property, stealing arms and ammunition from British forces, and kidnapping judges and officers. That's what the Zionist movement resorted to. In 1942, a small group of Zionist extremists led by Abraham Stern. Stern was the founder of the Stern Gang. The Stern Gang is an offshoot of the Irgun. The Irgun is a Zionist militia. The Stern Gang was eventually became led. The leader of the Stern Gang eventually became Yitzhak Shamir. Yitzhak Shamir eventually became the Prime Minister of Israel. The leader of the Irgun was Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin eventually became the Prime Minister of Israel. Why am I saying that? This is kind of just a slightly off topic. It's to show that you can reach the higher echelons of leadership in Israel, not despite what you've done in terms of your terrorist actions against Palestinians, but because of what you've done to Palestinians. It's a badge of honor. Okay, so 1942, this small gang of Zionist extremists. Oh, by the way, the Stern Gang. Something little small fact about them. Guess who financed them? Who gave them financial and military support? The Nazi regime in Germany. They financed them. Okay? So, in August of 1944, the High Commissioner, which is pretty much the ruler in Palestine under the British Mandatory Authorities, narrowly escaped death in an ambush outside of Jerusalem. And 3 months later, the British Minister of State in the Middle East, Lord Moyne, was assassinated in Cairo by 2 members of the Stern Gang. So they didn't just go after British officials in Palestine. They went throughout to go after British officials. The Irgun was also responsible for much destruction of government property in 1944 as well. And they operated under their own secret command, and they operated mainly in the actions of sabotage and terrorism against the mandatory authorities. There's an infamous example here that I want to touch on. The King David Hotel bombing of 1946. This is the most infamous example of the Zionist terrorist campaign. The explosion wrecked a wing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which contained the offices of the government secretariat as well as part of the military headquarters, and killed 86 public servants, Palestinian Arab, Jewish, and British, as well as 5 members of the public. All of this eventually led to the British imposing martial law to basically restore order. Not impose martial law because of Palestinians and what they did. Imposing martial law because of the Zionist terrorist campaign in Palestine. Remember Winston Churchill? We talked about him. Great friend of the Zionist movement. He's the one that said Balfour Declaration is of paramount importance. He put Balfour Declaration on the map and said this is the #1 thing that we're focusing on. What did Churchill say about all this? If our dreams for Zionism are to end in the smoke of assassins' pistols, and our labors for its future are to produce a new set of gangsters worthy of Nazi Germany, many, like myself, will have to reconsider the position we have maintained so consistently and so long in the past. If there is to be any hope of a peaceful and successful future for Zionism, these wicked activities must cease, and those responsible for them must be destroyed, root and branch. So these are not just one-off acts by the Zionist movement. These were terrorist campaigns against Great Britain. For what? For saying that you must share in government, that you must be an equal participant in the country. But no, the Zionist movement did not want equality. The Zionist movement wanted supremacy. And that is what we are seeing today. And for the last 76 years, and there's a word for this type of system, apartheid. It's racial domination. That's exactly what the Zionist movement was after. And when Great Britain's pulling back against that agenda, now you're going against the ideology of Zionism. And that is at the core of the founding of the State of Israel. So, of course, it had to have been rejected. Okay, so they rejected the white paper in 1939, engaged in terrorist activities since then. So Great Britain, the Zionist organization sought support from the US. So now this is where the US takes a bigger role. And then, decades later, the US is the main player in this. The Zionist organization sought support from the US to substitute the loss of support from Great Britain, or what it perceived as the loss of support. The Jewish Agency executive met in New York and declared the aim of creating a Jewish state in Palestine through unlimited immigration. This became the declared policy of the Zionist organization. So the Zionist organization utterly rejected the white paper and was described as attempting to nullify Jewish rights to immigration. This is what was declared at the Biltmore Conference, to immigration and settlement in Palestine, and constitutes a breach and repudiation of the Balfour Declaration. The conference, quote, urges that the gates of Palestine be open, that the Jewish Agency be vested with control of immigration into Palestine and with the necessary authority for upbuilding the country, including the development of its unoccupied and uncultivated lands, and that Palestine be established as a Jewish commonwealth integrated in the structure of the new democratic world. And President Harry Truman at the time eventually endorsed the Biltmore program in a letter to Mr. Clement Attlee, who became the leader, in which he called on the British government to open the gates of Palestine to an additional 100,000 of the, quote, homeless Jews of Europe. Now, just let me paint the picture here. World War II comes to an end, September 1945. The League of Nations is dissolved, 1946. So a new diplomatic and political international body was established, the United Nations, the baby United Nations. So the US is now involved. The outcome of direct involvement, the US involvement was the appointment of an Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry. This was in 1946. The goal was to make some type of recommendation for Palestine. The US President, Truman, said this: I am very happy. Let me see if I have that quote here. Well, let's go over the recommendation first. So the committee recommended, listen to this, the continuation of the mandate that the mandatory power had found unworkable. These are my words. But they said the continuation of the mandate. But Great Britain already said it's not workable. We can't continue the mandate. It doesn't work. We're butting heads. There's violence. There's too much going on. Oh no, just go ahead, continue that thing. Something major is going to happen if we continue that thing, as we will see next week. Something major is going to happen. So, in the course of the examination by British and American officials, a scheme was produced for 2 autonomous provinces in Palestine that continued to be governed under the British High Commissioner. Of course, it was rejected by the Zionist movement. The scheme did receive approval by the British government to have, because that's what they initially wanted, but not the US government. So now they're butting heads with the US government. Okay, this double screen. Oop. Go back. Okay. I guess the quote didn't pull up here. So let me read you the quote from the US president. I am very happy that the request which I made for the immediate admission of 100,000 Jews into Palestine has been unanimously endorsed by the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry. The transference of these unfortunate people should now be accomplished with the greatest dispatch. I am also pleased that the committee recommends, in effect, the abrogation of the White Paper of 1939, including existing restrictions on immigration and land acquisition to permit the further development of the Jewish national home. Boy, was Chaim Weizmann happy with that. Oh, you're going to open the gates of Palestine to more? That's exactly what we want. We want more of this people so we can outnumber this people, right? But there were some admissions made in this report. Great Britain admitted that the Zionist movement had already developed a state within a state. So even before the White Paper in 1939, there was a, quote, Jewish shadow government in Palestine. The Jews have developed under the aegis of the Jewish Agency and the Jewish National Council, which were allowed to work within Palestine because of the mandate. Were allowed to have international representation abroad because of the mandate. They have now built a, quote, strong and tightly woven community. There thus exists a virtual Jewish non-territorial state with its own executive and legislative organs, paralleled in many respects to the mandatory administration, and serving as the concrete symbol of the Jewish national home. The state is already there. We already did all the work for them up to that point. So now they can resort to illegal immigration and terrorist acts and try to push us away. And still spew the propaganda. We're trying to fight for our lives. The Arabs want to drive us to the sea, even though all the while we're putting together a plan to get the British out of there so we can continue our project. The Jewish shadow government has ceased to cooperate with the administration in the maintenance of law and order and in the suppression of terrorism. So, the Zionist organization met in 1947. This is the Zionist Congress, okay? 5 decades after 1897. That was the first Zionist Congress. That was the first session that we went over. Theodor Herzl led that one. This is now 5 decades later. They rejected any kind of division at that point. And they demanded, the Zionist organization, that Palestine be established as a Jewish commonwealth, integrated in the structure of the democratic world. Yeah, right, democratic world. That the gates of Palestine be open to Jewish immigration, that the Jewish agency be vested with the control of immigration into Palestine and with the necessary authority for the upbuilding of the country. And Great Britain said, at that point, it's over. Great Britain relinquished its mandatory role and handed over Palestine to the United Nations. We are done. We want out. We quit Palestine. And this is the statement that was made in the House of Commons. His Majesty's government have been faced with an irreconcilable conflict of principles. There are in Palestine about 1.2 million Arabs and 600,000 Jews. If a conflict has to be resolved by an arbitrary decision, that is not a decision which His Majesty's government are empowered as mandatory to take. His Majesty's government have of themselves no power under the terms of the mandate to award the country either to the Arabs or to the Jews, or even to partition it between them. We have therefore reached the conclusion that the only course now open to us is to submit the problem to the judgment of the United Nations. And this is where we get to the UN's involvement in this, and the UN role, and what it eventually produced. And next week, we're only going to talk about a 2-year period. But a lot happened in that 2-year period. Now we're going to enter the Nakba period, and that will be next week. But now Great Britain, remember, World War II ended, League of Nations dissolved, the UN was created. Great Britain fell from the great power of the day to a second-tier nation as a result of World War II. And really, that role, the second-tier role, was solidified after the Suez Crisis in the 1950s. But after World War II, basically, Great Britain was no longer the major player. Now there were only 2 players that really controlled the international scene: Soviet Union and the United States. But in Palestine, the U.S. had a much greater role, and that role just intensified over time. So next week, we'll get into the UN's involvement, what it proposed, and the ins and outs of that leading up to the Nakba period. So I'll stop it there, and I'll take some questions. We actually finished with good time because we started early. I don't know.
First question I have for you is,
Fadla.
I keep seeing this historically. Arabs and Jews, they're not equal, in my opinion. Arab could be Palestine at least, could be Muslim, or they are Muslim, Christian, and Jewish.
Right. No. Okay. So here's what. Okay, it can get a little dicey, but here's the proper, I would say, framing of the identities of the people there. You are either in Palestine now. I'm talking about Palestine, not other parts of the Arab world. You are either Palestinian Arab, Palestinian Jew, and you could be a Jew from the Ashkenazi brand. You could be a Jew from the Mizrahi brand, from the Sephardim. So that's more sub elements, right? But the overarching identity is Palestinian. So when you see the word Arab, when they refer to Arab and Jews, they're talking about Palestinian hyphen Arab, Palestinian hyphen Jew. That's how they refer to. That's why when we talk about Palestinians today, we say Palestinian. I like to put a hyphen there, just so that's more descriptive and more particular, and I think it's more accurate to say that. But for ease, when you talk about Israel Palestine, you talk when someone says, we want justice and peace between the Palestinians and Israelis, for example. Okay, I get what you mean, but those are loaded terms because there are Israelis who are Palestinian. So but we throw out these terms and we want to give it more definitive meaning. I think the more definitive way would be to hyphenate them.
My problem is nowadays when you listen to Israelis inside Palestine, they say Arabs, which lead me to believe.
Good point. Go ahead, finish your question because I have a response to that.
They lead me to believe that they're saying they're Arab means go to Jordan, go to Syria, go to Lebanon. You're not Palestinian.
Yeah.
They're like, and they're killing the term Palestinian like as if it didn't exist.
Okay, so There's a whole session, by the way, that I can give just on that. Okay, but a little bit of Israeli Constitution 101. Okay, within the 48 area, which is the internationally recognized borders of Israel, Israel does not recognize a Palestinian nationality. It also does not recognize an Israeli nationality. In America, yes, we have our own troubles here, but in America, constitutionally speaking, if you're an American, you have the same exact rights as anybody who is American. Polish American, Latino American, Arab American, Asian American, Black American, doesn't matter. So long as you're American, whether through naturalization, it doesn't matter how you got there. You're an American, under the law, equal 100%. There's no preference one over the other, on paper. In Israel, that's not the case. The overarching nationality is not Israeli, it's Jewish. Jewish nationality is the overarching nationality. And the Supreme Court of Israel even had to not admit it outright, but sort of admit it by saying we cannot give you, Jews of this country, Israeli nationality. Because if we do that, we are, in just one stroke of the pen, we are making the Arabs equal to you. Can't do that. So you're all Israeli. You can all be Israeli, but Jewish nationality is the overarching nationality. That's where most of the rights come from. And we have to limit the rights for the indigenous, well, then they don't call them indigenous, for the Arab population. Why don't they use the word Palestinian? Because you're denied your national label. See, Arab is we think of that as the ethnic label. The national label is Palestinian. You don't have a nationality. What are you talking about? You're Arab Muslim, you're Arab Christian, you're divided by your religion. You can have that. A Palestinian? No, that's for the West Bank people, for the Jerusalem people, for the Gaza people, for the refugees. They're Palestinians, even though you come from the same family, from the same villages. But you are Israeli Arabs or Arab Israelis. Because if we attach the national label to you, now we have to give you national rights. You don't get that. That's just brief, but there's laws that back that up. There's 65 plus laws on the books right now in Israel that directly or indirectly discriminate against the Palestinian Arab minority. Let me give you one law, the Human Dignity and Liberty Law. This is part of Israeli constitutional law. And the main header of the law is, or the title is, human dignity and liberty. There's a word that was intentionally omitted. Quality. Dignity, fine. Liberty, okay. Quality, no. Why? Okay, dignity, we can work around that. You know, like, we can give it our own subjective meaning, and the courts did do that. The courts had to read into that law the word equality because they're a liberal court. They have to seem, benign and liberal and even-handed and, just and all of these wonderful things. So they had to, because there was a challenge on the law. There was a group that challenged it. So they said, okay, fine, equality is part of the law. Even though it's not written in there, we're going to add it in there. But it's equality only to the extent that it is consistent with human dignity and liberty. So it's equality up to a point. And then once you reach that point, that's it. So long as you get your dignity and liberty, fine. Equality is fine up to that point. But there's this missing part that you don't belong in, that belongs to a different people. They don't say it like that, but that's exactly what they do. And in that same law, there's an exception in the law. What is that? What is that exception? There's an exception to human dignity and liberty, preserving those things, if the law befits the values of the state of Israel. What are those values? Jewish and democratic. But Jewish and democratic. Jewish and democratic. So if it's a law to preserve Jewish supremacy, Jewish majority, we can violate human dignity and liberty. So if you read the text as a lawyer, when you read the exception, you will take out of it Zionism. Like when I read the laws, I'm like, oh, I see Zionism playing all over this. I mean, you can see the way that they have to word the phraseology, the terminology, the exceptions that are embedded in the law, words that are omitted. You have to look at what is there and what is not there. Why would equality not be part of that law? It's an interesting question. So sorry for the long-winded answer, but you opened up a can of worms with that one. You can give a whole session on that actually. Couldn't handle it anymore. They fell to a second-tier power after World War II, and they realized that the mandate was unworkable. The only solution that was given to them was continue the mandate. We just told you it's unworkable. What do you mean continue the mandate? And no, we're not going to do the right thing. We're not going to say that the Balfour Declaration was wrong. We were wrong. We renounced the mandate. Instead, we're going to implement democracy. One man, one vote. The people there that are there right now can stay, and they will vote in their government, and you will have equality, and you'll have a democratic government. We can't do that, because then we're admitting the past 20 years was all flawed. It was wrong. We can't admit that we were wrong the whole time. Sorry. We're just going to say that it was unworkable. It's irreconcilable. Blame it on them. They can't work it out, even though we caused the mess that allowed the Zionist movement to flourish and allowed the Palestinian Arab population to diminish in its strength, and also to worry itself that it would lose its economic and political and social future. Yes, that was all because of you. So Great Britain said, I'm not going to do what's right, but I'm not going to continue doing what's wrong, so I'm out. That's exactly how it played out. Yeah, it was like, I'm not going to do what's right, but I don't want to continue doing what's wrong. We did so much wrong. We can't say it that way, but we did so much wrong. We can't fix it. Yes, it's a mess that we caused. We're not going to admit that we caused it, but it's a mess that we caused, and the only way to fix it is to do what's right. But then one side is not going to like it, and that's going to cause more problems. We don't want to deal with those problems. And now we're not as strong as we once were. You know what? You new body, UN, United Nations, you handle it. You deal with it. It's your problem now. I'm out. Sorry for the colloquial way of explaining it, but that was pretty much the gist of it. Any more questions? We kind of finished early, so that's good. Oh, there we go. The best question of the night. Go ahead. Yeah. 26 million dunams of land. And there's what? How many trillions of dunams exist in the world? That's a good question, because it was so fertile, it was so beautiful, and the people there are so beautiful, and they built up a wonderful community there that they wanted to take that from the Palestinians and make a new people there and install a new government there. So it was wrong from the beginning. If Palestine was not so beautiful and Palestine was not so rich in resources, they would not have wanted it. But it's a beautiful land. That's why we talk about it, because we never want to give up on it, right? Like now, you mean? From Oh, okay. So unrelated to this, right? You're talking about now, like today. Okay. Nothing really. Israel wants to make the claim that it's offering some kind of intelligence help to the United States, but it's even whatever intelligence that it's providing to the U.S., it's not really helping the U.S. enhance its image. It's not helping the U.S. enhance its objectives or interests at all. They're just superfluous and unnecessary. But if you want to do a comparative analysis, we're giving way more than what they're giving us. If I'm trying to look at it as a neutral observer and just say, what are we gaining from this relationship type thing? Obviously, the negatives far outweigh any kind of positives that you can potentially extract from it, which is very little to nothing.
I think she meant what resources are there and how some natural resources that like Israel wanted to exploit.
Oh, what Israel wants? I thought the U.S. You said.
Well, now I don't know.
Okay. Well, okay. Okay, we'll talk later then. Yeah. Stop this. Yeah, next week we'll get into